There is a moment in every empire's history where it overreaches. Where the machine that has crushed everything in its path becomes so confident in its own invincibility that it stops calculating the cost of its actions. Where power stops being a tool and becomes an addiction. Where the people doing the crushing stop seeing human beings on the other side of what they're doing. Rome had that moment in 60 AD. It lasted about an afternoon. The consequences lasted years. Prasutagus died quietly. The exact date is lost to history, somewhere around 60 AD, after years of careful, exhausting diplomacy that had kept his people alive and his kingdom intact. He died having done everything right. Having played by Rome's rules, respected Rome's authority, and trusted that a lifetime of loyalty would mean something when it mattered most. He left behind a will. Half his kingdom to his 2 daughters. Half to Emperor Nero. A final act of compromise from a man who had spent his entire reign compromising. He believed, genuinely, desperately believed, that by giving Rome half of everything, Rome would protect the other half. He also left behind a wife. And Rome, in its infinite wisdom, decided that none of that was relevant. The moment Prasutagus drew his last breath, the Roman procurator Decianus Catus sent his agents into Iceni territory. Not to honor the will. Not to negotiate a transition. Not to offer any of the respect that decades of loyalty might have earned. They came to take everything. And they did not come politely. To understand what happened next, you need to understand that the seizure of Iceni lands wasn't just Decianus Catus acting on his own initiative. It was part of a broader, systematic pattern of Roman financial predation that had been building for years. There was a man in Rome at this time named Seneca. You may know him as one of the greatest Stoic philosophers in history, the man who wrote about virtue, restraint, and the importance of living according to reason. He was also, simultaneously, one of the wealthiest men in the empire. And one of the ways he had built that wealth was by extending enormous loans to British tribal leaders. Loans that the Britons hadn't exactly asked for, but which Rome's financial system had effectively forced on them. When Prasutagus died, Seneca called in those loans. All of them. Immediately. Without negotiation or grace period. Think about that for a moment. The philosopher who wrote that a wise man should be indifferent to wealth was personally engineering the financial ruin of an entire people. History has a way of making hypocrites of everyone, but rarely this efficiently. So when Catus's agents arrived in Iceni territory, they weren't arriving into a vacuum. They were arriving into a community already being squeezed from every direction. Debts being called in, tribute being demanded, and now the seizure of every estate, every piece of land, every possession that the Iceni nobles had spent generations building. The Iceni nobles had their ancestral estates taken as if they were conquered enemies rather than Roman allies. The king's own relatives were enslaved. Everything Prasutagus had spent his life protecting was dismantled in a matter of weeks. And then they came for Boudica. This is the part of the story that Roman historians recorded with a casualness that is almost more disturbing than the events themselves. Tacitus, one of Rome's own, writing with the particular discomfort of a man describing something he cannot fully justify, tells us what happened in plain, spare language. Boudica was flogged. Publicly. In front of her people. A queen of an allied kingdom, a woman who, by some interpretations, may have held Roman citizen status through her husband's alliance, treated like a common criminal, stripped of dignity in the most literal physical way Rome knew how to deliver, and her daughters were raped by Roman soldiers. Let that land. This was not a rogue unit acting outside orders. This was Roman policy in action. This was Decianus Catus's administration making a deliberate statement about what allied status actually meant the moment a king died and left only women behind. It meant nothing. It had always meant nothing. The Iceni had been allies of Rome for 17 years and it had bought them exactly this: the right to be humiliated in an organized, official manner rather than a disorganized one. Tacitus, who was not a sentimental man and who was capable of describing battlefield massacres with clinical detachment, describes these events with a brevity that historians have read as shock. As if even he, a Roman writing for a Roman audience, could not quite bring himself to linger on what his empire had done. Rome had just made the worst mistake in the history of its occupation of Britain. There is a version of this story where Boudica breaks. Where the humiliation, the grief, the physical pain, the sight of what happened to her daughters, where all of that is simply too much and she collapses under the weight of it. Where Rome gets what it wanted. A broken woman. A leaderless people. A quiet province that has learned its lesson. That is not what happened. What happened is that Boudica stood up. Not metaphorically. Literally. She stood up and she looked at the people around her. Her people, the Iceni who had watched everything, and something passed between them that no Roman administrator could have predicted, prepared for, or stopped. The flogging that was meant to humiliate her had done the opposite. It had made her visible. It had made her cause undeniable. It had given every single person who had swallowed their anger for 20 years a face to put on everything they had been forced to endure. She didn't need to give a speech. Not yet. The speech would come. But in that moment, standing in the dirt where Rome had put her, something shifted that could not be unshifted. She had been a queen. Now she was something far more dangerous. She was a reason. The Iceni nobles who had watched their estates seized had a choice. They could accept it, swallow one more humiliation, rebuild quietly, hope that Rome's appetite was satisfied. Or they could look at the woman standing in front of them and make a different calculation entirely. They made the different calculation. Word spread through Iceni territory with a speed that tells you everything about how long this anger had been building. It didn't need coordination. It didn't need a messenger system or a political strategy. It needed one thing, a moment so undeniable that it cut through every argument for caution, every reason for patience, every practical case for continued cooperation. Rome had provided that moment with extraordinary efficiency. She came to them not as a grieving widow asking for help, but as a leader presenting a reality. Rome had shown them exactly what their loyalty was worth. Rome had shown them exactly what their treaties meant. There was no version of cooperation that ended in anything other than this, slow absorption, piece by piece, generation by generation, until there was nothing left of the Iceni that wasn't Roman. The choice was not between war and peace. The choice was between war now and extinction later. "I am not asking you to fight for me," Boudica told them, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has nothing left to lose and has found in that loss a terrible freedom. "I am asking you to fight for yourselves. For your children. For every person who has watched a Roman soldier walk through their market and said nothing because they were afraid. The cost of silence," she said, "is everything." One by one they nodded. She sent word to the Trinovants, the tribe whose capital, Camulodunum, had been seized and turned into a Roman colony, whose land had been taken to build a temple to the Emperor Claudius. They had been waiting for exactly this moment. They answered. Other tribes answered. What had begun as the fury of one woman and one people was becoming something Rome had not seen in Britain and would not see again for centuries. An army, over 100,000 strong, united under a single red-haired commander who had been given every reason in the world to hate the people she was about to fight. If this story is hitting differently than you expected, if you came here thinking you knew who Boudica was and you're realizing you didn't, hit that like button and subscribe right now. The next section is where this army reaches its first target. And what happens there is something Rome never forgot. The first target was obvious. It was the city that stood as the most visible symbol of everything that had been done to the people of Britain. Camulodunum. Modern-day Colchester. The city Rome had built on stolen Trinovantine land, with stolen labor, to celebrate the emperor who had stolen the island. The city where Roman veterans had settled into comfortable retirement on farms that had belonged to British families. The city that housed the great temple of Claudius, a monument to Roman power so offensive to the Britons that it had functioned as an open wound for nearly 2 decades. The Romans in Camulodunum knew something was coming. They had seen the omens, or at least that's how they described what was building around them. The Statue of Victory at the city entrance fell from its base without explanation, facing away from the enemy as if retreating. Women reported hearing screaming in the empty forum at night. The estuary appeared to run red. Were these things real? Almost certainly some combination of natural phenomena, mass anxiety, and deliberate propaganda. But what they tell us that is historically true is this. The Romans in Camulodunum were afraid. And they had every reason to be. They sent to Decianus Catus for help. The man who had ordered the flogging of a queen and the assault of her daughters. The man who had personally triggered this catastrophe with his greed and contempt. The man whose decisions had set over 100,000 people marching toward this city. He sent 200 soldiers. 200. For what was about to arrive. Boudica's army destroyed Camulodunum in a day. The veterans, the colonists, the soldiers, overwhelmed. The temple of Claudius held out for 2 days behind its thick walls, packed with survivors who had nowhere else to go. Then it fell too. Archaeologists excavating modern Colchester have found the evidence 2,000 years later. A destruction layer up to half a meter thick in places. Burnt debris. Smashed military equipment. Possessions buried in a hurry by people who never came back to retrieve them. Rome sent the 9th Legion to stop her. Boudica's army cut it apart. The infantry was decimated. The survivors fled. The 9th Legion, one of Rome's most storied fighting forces, had been functionally destroyed by a woman Rome had tried to break with a flogging. And Decianus, the architect of everything that had caused this, the man whose greed and brutality had turned a loyal allied kingdom into an existential threat, fled to Gaul. He left the province he had helped set on fire and never came back. The city that Rome had built as an eternal monument to its own power was ash, and Boudica was just getting started. Camulodunum was gone. The 9th Legion was destroyed. The procurator had fled. And the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was 250 miles away on the island of Anglesey, finishing his campaign against the Druids, when the news reached him. He turned around immediately. But between him and his province stood Boudica's army, still growing, still moving, heading toward the most important city in Roman Britain, Londinium. A city of traders, merchants, and civilians. A city with no walls and no garrison strong enough to defend it. A city that Suetonius would reach before Boudica, and then face the most impossible decision of his military career. Stay and fight, and probably lose everything. Or abandon it entirely. Next episode we find out what he chose. And why the answer left a scar under the streets of modern London that archaeologists found 2,000 years later.